My neighbor spent $6,000 building a privacy fence that extended 11 feet onto my property, told me it was basically his land anyway since I never used it, and then called the police on me when I had it removed. What he didn't know was that I'd had a full property survey done 2 years earlier for an unrelated reason, and I'd kept it in a drawer the entire time waiting for exactly this kind of situation. I bought my house about 6 years ago, a modest 3-bedroom on a half-acre lot in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The backyard is mostly wooded, sloping down toward a small creek that runs along the back property line. It's not a particularly usable part of the yard, too many trees, too much of a slope, so for the first few years I owned the house, I genuinely never thought much about that section at all. About a year after I moved in, a new family bought the house next door. The husband, Greg, was friendly enough at first, the kind of neighbor who waves from his driveway and occasionally makes small talk about lawnmowers. His wife, Denise, mostly kept to herself. They had 2 kids, a dog, and within about 6 months of moving in, started doing a lot of landscaping work, new patio, a shed, eventually a pool. About 2 years ago, completely unrelated to any of this, I decided to refinance my mortgage. As part of that process, the lender required an updated property survey since the original survey on file was from the 1980s and had some discrepancies the title company wanted resolved. I paid about $450 for a licensed surveyor to come out, mark the actual property corners with stakes and flags, and produce an updated, legally recorded survey document. The survey confirmed that my property line extended about 15 feet further into the wooded area than the old fence line, left by the previous owners, had suggested. There had apparently been a fence there decades ago that had rotted away entirely, but its old position had been slightly off from the actual legal boundary the whole time. I filed the survey away, didn't think much of it, and life went on. The wooded area remained wooded, nobody's day-to-day life changed. Fast forward to about 8 months ago. Greg and Denise decided they wanted more privacy for their new pool, and Greg told me, almost as an afterthought while we were both out getting our mail, that he was planning to put up a privacy fence along the back there to separate his yard from the wooded area. I said something like, "Sounds good, let me know if you need me to do anything on my end," genuinely not thinking it would be an issue since the wooded area wasn't something I used. A few weeks later, I came home from a work trip to find a brand new 6-foot privacy fence running through what I'd always considered my wooded section, not along the old, rotted fence line from decades ago, which itself had been roughly on the actual property line in most spots, but noticeably further onto my side, cutting off a chunk of the wooded area and incorporating it into Greg's yard. I want to be clear that I didn't immediately pull out the survey and start measuring things with a tape measure. My first instinct was just mild annoyance. The fence looked like it ate into my yard a little, but I figured maybe I was misjudging the angle, or maybe Greg had just built it slightly off from where the old line was without realizing, and it probably wasn't a big deal either way since I never used that section. I mentioned it to Greg casually. "Hey, looks like the new fence might be a little over on my side compared to where the old one was. No big deal, just wanted to flag it." Greg's response surprised me. Instead of, "Oh, let me check that," he got immediately defensive. "I had it built right where the old fence line was. Maybe your memory of where the old fence was is off." This was technically true. My memory of the old fence line could have been off since it had been mostly rotted and overgrown when I moved in, so I let it go again, for months. Then, about 3 months ago, I noticed Greg's family had started actually using that section of the wooded area, clearing some underbrush, putting in a small fire pit, even setting up a hammock between 2 trees that I was now fairly confident were on my side of any reasonable property line, old or new. This is when I finally went and dug out the survey from 2 years ago. I spent an afternoon with the survey document, a long tape measure, and some marking flags, walking the actual legal property line based on the surveyor's documented measurements from the recorded corner markers, 2 of which, conveniently, were still intact, small metal stakes set in concrete that the surveyor had confirmed and that I hadn't disturbed. The new fence wasn't just a little over. At its furthest point, it was 11 feet onto my property. The fire pit Greg's family had built was entirely on my side of the legal line. The hammock trees were both on my side. 11 feet across the roughly 80-foot length of that fence section works out to a meaningful chunk of land, probably close to 700 square feet that Greg had essentially annexed. I'll be honest, Even with the survey in hand, my first move wasn't to immediately escalate. I went over to Greg's house, brought a printed copy of the relevant page of the survey, and tried to have a calm conversation. I explained that I'd had a survey done a couple years back for a refinance, that I'd just gotten around to actually checking the fence line against it, and that it looked like the fence was about 11 feet onto my property at points, and could we maybe talk about either moving it or working out some kind of arrangement. Greg looked at the survey for about 10 seconds, and then said, "This is ridiculous. We've used this area for almost 2 years. You never said anything. At this point, it's basically our land. You can't just spring a piece of paper on me and expect us to tear out a $6,000 fence." I pointed out that I had said something months ago when the fence first went up, and that we've used it for 2 years doesn't actually change a legal property line, especially when the relevant survey was completed before the fence was even built. Greg's response was to tell me, fairly aggressively, that I should talk to a lawyer if I had a problem, and then walked back into his house. So I did talk to a lawyer, a real estate attorney specifically, a 1-hour consultation that confirmed what I already suspected. The survey was legally valid, recorded with the county, and Greg's fence was unambiguously encroaching on my property by the amounts I'd measured. The lawyer explained that I had a few options, ranging from a formal demand letter requesting Greg remove the encroaching portion of fence, about an 80-foot run, or relocate it to the actual property line. Or, if Greg refused entirely, a civil suit for encroachment, which could result in a court order requiring removal at Greg's expense. I decided to start with the demand letter, sent formally through the attorney, giving Greg 30 days to remove the encroaching section of fence, about an 80-foot run, or relocate it to the actual property line. Greg's response, communicated through a somewhat panicked phone call to me directly, skipping his own potential lawyer entirely, it seemed, was a mix of anger and what sounded like genuine disbelief that this was actually happening. He offered at one point to just pay me for the land, which legally isn't really how property lines work without a formal subdivision and sale process, something the attorney had already explained wasn't a quick fix. After the 30-day window passed with no action from Greg, I had a fencing company come out, at my own expense initially, though the demand letter made clear I'd be pursuing reimbursement, and remove the 11-foot encroaching sections at each end of the fence, essentially creating 2 gaps where the fence now stopped short of Greg's property line on both ends, with the middle section, which it turned out actually was roughly on the legal line, remaining intact. This is the part where it gets almost comically petty. While the fencing crew was working, on my property, removing a structure that was confirmed to be on my property with documentation to support it, Greg called the police. 2 officers showed up. I'd actually anticipated this might happen, so I had copies of the recorded survey, the demand letter, and a copy of the county's confirmation that no fence permit had ever been filed for Greg's project, all printed and ready in a folder by the back door. The conversation with the officers took about 15 minutes. I explained the situation, showed the survey with the recorded property corners and measurements, showed the demand letter and the 30-day window that had passed. One of the officers walked the fence line himself, looked at the marked stakes from the survey, which I'd left in place, and basically told Greg in front of me that this appeared to be a civil property matter, that I had documentation supporting my position, and that removing a structure from your own property, even one someone else built, generally isn't a police matter, unless there's some kind of separate dispute on how it was done, like damage to Greg's actual fence panels, which there wasn't. The crew had carefully detached and stacked the removed sections on Greg's side of the new line, ready for him to do with as he liked. The officers left without taking any action against me. Greg, from what I could see through my kitchen window, spent the rest of that afternoon staring at the 2 new gaps in his fence and the neatly stacked panels sitting in his yard. It's been about 3 months since then. Greg eventually hired his own fencing company to reconfigure the remaining fence to actually sit on the correct property line, a job that, including removing the old stacked panels and adjusting the layout around his pool area, ended up costing him close to $4,000 on top of the original $6,000 he'd already spent. We don't really talk anymore. The occasional mail-getting wave has stopped. Denise, his wife, did apparently tell a mutual neighbor that she'd told Greg from the start that he should get an actual survey done before building anything, which, if true, makes the whole situation feel even more avoidable than it already was. The hammock is gone, the fire pit got moved, and there's a very visible, very fresh-looking gap in landscaping where Greg's expensive new fence now sits exactly 11 feet further over than it used to, right where it should have been all along.